The scent of burnt sugar and cheap coffee hit Betty's senses before consciousness fully returned. Unfamiliar cotton against her skin, a dull ache behind her temples, and the slow, mortifying realization that the oversized blue button-down she wore, the only thing she wore, belonged to Anthony Chun, the struggling designer whose name sat third from the top on her Monday termination list, Betty Morrison. The CEO who'd built an empire on ruthless efficiency and emotional distance had just woken up in the guest room a man she was planning to fire in less than 48 hours. And somewhere beyond the thin walls, she could hear the sound of a whisk hitting a metal bowl and the bright, tuneless humming of a 7-year-old daughter. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel, and it proves that powerful stories resonate everywhere. Betty Morrison has spent 17 years building her reputation as the most ruthless CEO in the architectural industry. She fired people without hesitation, slashed budgets with surgical precision, and treated emotions like expensive liabilities she couldn't afford. That Friday night, standing in a ballroom full of colleagues she didn't respect, she was mentally finalizing a list of 17 employees who would lose their jobs on Monday morning. Anthony Chen's name sat at number 3, right between a marketing executive who took too many lunch breaks and a receptionist who spent too much time on social media. She knew very little about Anthony Chen beyond what his file told her. Junior designer, adequate performance, $62,000 salary, single father who left every day at exactly 5:30. The file didn't mention that he was brilliant. It didn't say anything about the designs he created after his daughter went to sleep. It certainly didn't explain why a man with his talent had been buried in the lowest tier of her firm for 3 years. Betty only saw numbers, and Anthony's numbers said he was expendable. The storm hit during the gala with unexpected violence. Power failed across the city, bridges closed, roads flooded. Betty's hotel became unreachable, and Anthony, terrified and probably trying to protect his job, offered her his guest room. She accepted because the alternative was spending the night with 200 networking vultures, and at least Anthony's house would be quiet. She didn't think about how inappropriate it was. She didn't consider what it meant that she was about to spend a night in the home of a man whose termination papers were already drafted on her laptop. The drive to his house confirmed everything she'd suspected about his financial situation. The car was 7 years old with a child's booster seat in the back. The house needed paint. The porch light was broken. This was what happened when you earned $62,000 in a city where rent alone consumed half that. This was what happened when you chose to be a parent instead of climbing the corporate ladder. Betty felt nothing looking at it except a vague confirmation that her assessment of Anthony as someone without ambition had been correct. His daughter Alara answered the door in princess pajamas, and Betty was reminded uncomfortably of how much children saw. The girl looked at her father with complete trust, looked at Betty with cautious curiosity, and asked questions that adults knew better than to ask. Anthony's mother Linda was there too, taking care of Alara during the storm, being the support system that let Anthony work late at galas while someone kept his daughter safe. Betty had no such support system. She never needed one because she'd never let anything matter more than her company. Linda gave her dry clothes, Anthony's clothes, which was mortifying, and showed her to the guest room. Betty lay on an air mattress surrounded by children's artwork and unfinished blueprints, listening to Anthony read his daughter a bedtime story through thin walls, and wonder how she'd managed to end up in such a completely unprofessional situation. She told herself it didn't matter. Monday would come, and she'd fire him anyway, and this awkward night would become an amusing anecdote about the time a storm forced her to see how the other half lived. She fell asleep planning the email she'd send to HR, comfortable in the certainty that nothing about this night would change her decision. She was completely wrong. Betty woke up wearing Anthony's blue button-down shirt and couldn't immediately remember how it had gotten there. The guest room had been too warm in the middle of the night, and she'd found the shirt folded on the dresser with a note in careful handwriting offering her something cooler to wear. She'd changed half asleep and thought nothing of it. Now, in the harsh light of morning, she realized she was standing in her employee's house wearing nothing but his shirt, and the symbolism of that was too obvious to ignore. She needed to leave immediately, call a car service, get back to her hotel, and pretend this hadn't happened. She needed to reestablish the professional distance that the storm had eroded. She needed to remember that Anthony Chan was employee ID 2847, not a person with a complicated life that she'd accidentally glimpsed. But then she opened the bedroom door and saw the blueprints. They covered every wall in the hallway and continued into the kitchen beyond. Dozens of professional-grade architectural drawings that should have been displayed in prestigious galleries, not taped to peeling wallpaper with painter's tape. Betty moved closer and studied the first one, a community center with organic curves and windows positioned to maximize natural light without sacrificing efficiency. The design was extraordinary, the kind of work that won international awards and defined careers. The second blueprint showed a residential complex that solved problems Betty hadn't even known her firm was ignoring. High-density housing that didn't look like a prison, with green spaces and rooftop gardens and actual consideration for humans who would live there. Every design was brilliant. Every single one represented the future of sustainable urban architecture that Betty had been searching for in her senior designers for years. And every design was decorated with children's marker drawings, rainbows and stick figures and flowers labeled in wobbly handwriting by a 7-year-old who thought buildings should be colorful and happy. Betty stood in that hallway experiencing something she hadn't felt in years. Complete shock at her own miscalculation. She'd been about to fire a genius because his performance review said adequate, and he left work at 5:30 every day. She'd been about to eliminate the most talented designer in her entire firm because she trusted systems and metrics instead of actually looking at his work. Anthony found her staring at his blueprints, and he looked terrified. He explained that they were personal projects, things he worked on after Lara went to sleep, hobbies that weren't relevant to the firm's direction. He was apologizing for his brilliance because he thought Betty had discovered evidence of him wasting time. He had no idea he was looking at the work that would save both their careers. Betty told him the truth. The designs were genius, exactly what Morrison and Associates should be producing, and she'd been wrong about him in every possible way. She watched him process this information, watched him realize that the woman who'd been planning to fire him was now calling his work brilliant, and she saw the exact moment when he understood what had almost happened. "I'm on the list," he said quietly. "Aren't I?" She admitted it, because lying would have been worse. Yes, he'd been on the termination list. Yes, she'd planned to fire him Monday morning. Yes, she'd evaluated his entire career based on incomplete information and nearly destroyed his life because of it. The admission cost her something because Betty Morrison didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge mistakes, didn't show vulnerability. But standing in his kitchen wearing his shirt and seeing the evidence of her failure displayed on every wall, she couldn't maintain the fiction of her own infallibility. Anthony's careful composure cracked then, and he told her what her systems had missed. That he had a daughter who needed to be picked up by 6 or he'd be charged late fees he couldn't afford. That senior designers took credit for his ideas during office hours. That he worked on his real designs at home because the firm had no interest in his vision. That he left at 5:30 because that was the only way to be the parent Lara deserved. Every word was an indictment of the company Betty had built, the metrics she'd trusted, the systems she thought were objective but were actually just blind. She didn't know how to respond because responding meant admitting that she built a company that rewarded people for taking credit instead of doing work, that punished employees for having lives outside the office, that had systematically buried its most talented designer under 3 years of adequate performance reviews while mediocre managers got promoted. Then Alara walked in asking if Betty was staying for breakfast, and the moment defused. But the damage was done. Anthony knew he'd almost been fired. Betty knew she'd almost made the worst mistake of her career. And between them sat the uncomfortable truth that systems didn't see genius, and metrics didn't measure what actually mattered. Betty stayed for breakfast because leaving would have been cowardice. And whatever else she wasn't a coward. Listen, if you're still here, it means you're invested. You want to see what happens next. But here's the reality. Most people watch stories like this and scroll away without subscribing. They enjoy it, then vanish. If this story actually matters to you, if you genuinely care about how it ends, hit that subscribe button. It only takes a second. Otherwise, you'll probably forget this channel exists and miss all the other incredible stories I share. Breakfast became an education in everything Betty's business degree had never taught her. Alara appointed herself to her guide of her father's work, dragging over blueprints and explaining with 7-year-old confidence which designs were the best and why. She pointed to the children's museum Anthony had created, a building designed like interconnected tree houses with climbing walls and reading nooks and a roof shaped like solar panel leaves, and told Betty that buildings should make people happy, not just keep the rain out. It was the simplest, most obvious principle of architecture, and Betty's firm had forgotten it entirely. Morrison and Associates designed buildings that looked impressive in portfolios and won contracts from wealthy clients. They created structures that maximized profit and minimized cost. They built things that served balance sheets instead of communities. A 7-year-old understood something Betty's senior designers had never grasped, that architecture was about people, not profit margins. Betty studied the children's museum design while Alara explained each section she'd colored, and she understood that this wasn't just beautiful work. It was buildable work. The estimated construction cost was listed clearly for $0.2 million, which was reasonable for a project of the scope. Anthony hadn't just designed something artistic. He'd designed something practical. He'd balanced creativity with code compliance, vision with reality, beauty with budget. He was everything her senior team wasn't. Alara asked a question that had been hanging in the air since Betty woke up. Was she going to make Daddy go home? Was she going to fire the man whose house she'd slept in, whose shirt she was wearing, whose talent she completely failed to recognize? Betty heard herself promise a 7-year-old that no, she wasn't going to fire Anthony. The words came out before she could apply her usual calculus of strategic positioning and cost-benefit analysis. She just made an emotional decision based on a child's question, which was possibly the least professional thing she'd done in 20 years. And she meant it completely. After Alara left to get dressed, Anthony confronted her about making promises to his daughter. He didn't trust her sudden change of heart because he understood that guilt was temporary and business realities were permanent. He thought she felt sorry for him, thought she was offering charity because the storm had forced her to see him as a human being instead of an employee number. He told her he didn't need pity. He needed stability, needed to know he could afford new shoes and piano lessons and field trips without checking his bank account first. Betty understood then that Anthony had been living on the edge of financial disaster for 3 years while working for her, that every deadline extension he'd requested, every time he'd left at 5:30, every adequate performance review had been pushing him closer to the edge, that he'd been designing brilliant buildings at midnight after his daughter fell asleep, because that was the only time he had, and he'd done it anyway, because creating something meaningful mattered more than sleep. She told him about the Riverside Development Project, $85 million, 3 months until the client pulled the contract, her entire firm's future riding on producing something extraordinary. She explained that the layoffs hadn't been about cruelty, they'd been about desperation. She'd been hemorrhaging money paying designers who couldn't deliver what the client wanted, and she thought cutting staff would let her focus her resources on her senior team. But her senior team was a problem, and Anthony was a solution, and Betty was just arrogant enough to believe she could fix her mistake before it destroyed everything she'd built. She offered him lead architect, complete creative control over Riverside, a team he could select himself, the authority to transform Morrison and Associates into the kind of firm that produced work like what was taped to his kitchen walls. She was offering him everything he deserved and everything he'd never asked for, and she watched him struggle to believe it was real. Anthony asked why she was doing this, and Betty could have given him business justifications. The Riverside project, the firm's reputation, the competitive advantage of recognizing talent, all of it would have been true. But standing in his kitchen surrounded by blueprints decorated with crayon rainbows, she gave him the real answer. Because she was tired of being the person who only saw numbers, because his work reminded her why she'd started the firm, because his daughter understood something she'd forgotten, and because nearly firing him would have been the biggest mistake of her career. She offered him guarantees, a 5-year contract, guaranteed salary, benefits including childcare subsidies and flexible scheduling. She promised to mentor him through transition and support him against the senior designers who would inevitably push back. She told him his success was her success now, that if he failed, she failed, that she was betting her entire company on a junior designer whose talent she'd almost overlooked completely. Anthony asked for one more thing. The community center, the one Alara had color-coded. He wanted to build at cost, no profit, just so his daughter could see that the things they drew on walls could become real. It was a terrible business decision that would generate zero revenue and cost $4.2 million in resources that could have gone to profitable projects. Betty agreed immediately because sometimes the right decision wasn't the profitable one, and because a 7-year-old who believed buildings should make people happy deserved to see her favorite design become reality. Monday morning arrived, and Anthony stood outside the Morrison & Associates building wondering if the entire weekend had been an elaborate hallucination. He'd signed the contract late Sunday night after reading every clause twice, after talking it through with his mother, after lying awake imagining all the ways this could go wrong. The contract was real, 5 years guaranteed, stock options, benefits that would let him actually afford the life Alara deserved. But contracts could be broken, and promises could be forgotten, and he was about to walk into a building where everyone knew him as the adequate junior designer who left at 5:30. He walked in anyway because the alternative was staying trapped in adequate forever. Betty's text told him to come to her office at 9, and the elevator ride to the executive floor felt like ascending to his own execution. He'd only been on this floor twice before, and both times he'd been delivering documents for supervisors who were too important to use the stairs. Now he was walking in as lead architect, and the absurdity of that hadn't diminished over the weekend. Betty's office surprised him because it contained evidence that she was human. Coffee rings on papers, a jacket thrown carelessly over a chair, a framed photo of her with an elderly man both covered in sawdust. She told him the man was her father, a carpenter who'd taught her that buildings serve people, not egos. She'd forgotten that lesson, and Anthony's blueprints had reminded her. The storm had just forced her to see them. She explained the plan, announced his promotion at the 10 o'clock senior team meeting, canceled the layoffs, reorganized the firm around the Riverside project. There would be backlash, particularly from David Mercer, who'd been angling for lead architect for years. Anthony would need to survive the meeting and present his vision for Riverside, and the senior designers would need to see what Betty saw in his work. The meeting was brutal in exactly the way Anthony expected. 8 senior designers stared at him while Betty announced his promotion, and David Mercer's expression went from skeptical to openly hostile in seconds. He called a joke, pointed out that Anthony was a junior designer with no leadership experience and no major projects on his resume. The entire room agreed with him, and Anthony felt his carefully constructed confidence evaporate. Betty told him to show them, and Anthony pulled up his personal projects. The community center, the residential complex, the office building and civic center, and school renovation he designed after hours, while more credentialed people took credit for his daytime work. He explained that his architecture served people instead of profit margins, that buildings should make communities stronger and families happier and lives better. He told them he'd bring vision to Riverside, not credentials, and the willingness to work harder than anyone else in the room. It should have been humiliating, presenting hobby projects to people with prestigious degrees and decades of experience. But something shifted in the room as Anthony spoke. Some of the senior designers started looking interested instead of skeptical. They recognized real talent when they saw it, even if it came from an unexpected source. David stood up to protest, and Betty shut him down with the kind of cold authority that had built her empire. She told him to sit down or clean out his desk, and he sat. Then she told the entire room that Anthony was their lead architect. They would support him or leave, and politics were no longer acceptable. The meeting ended in silence, and Anthony sat alone afterward wondering what he'd just survived. Betty told him he'd done well, that David would get over it or leave, and that his new office was on the executive floor. The Riverside presentation was due Friday, which gave him 4 days to prove that her faith in him wasn't misplaced. She reminded him that this wasn't a favor. It was a business decision, and his job was to prove it was the right one. Then she told him his burnt pancakes had been objectively terrible and he should stick to architecture. And Anthony laughed because Betty Morrison had just bet her entire company on him and was still criticizing his cooking. His mother texted asking how it went, and Anthony told her he was lead architect. She responded that she was proud of him, that his father would have been proud too. Anthony hadn't thought about his father in years. The construction worker who'd encouraged him to study architecture because buildings outlived their creators. His father had died before seeing him graduate, before knowing that his encouragement had mattered. Betty texted telling him to stop being sentimental and get to work, and Anthony smiled because he had an office to move into and a city to redesign, and a daughter who deserved to see her color-coded dreams become reality. He got to work because buildings outlive their creators, and he had something worth creating. The foundation was solid now, both professionally and personally. Betty had seen past her own systems to recognize his talent. Anthony had stopped believing that being a good father made him a liability. The firm had canceled its layoffs and reorganized around vision instead of credentials. And somewhere in the future, a community center shaped like tree houses would be built at cost for a 7-year-old who believed buildings should make people happy. It wasn't a perfect ending because real life didn't have perfect endings. David would cause problems. The Riverside project would be challenging. Anthony would probably burn more pancakes and leave at 5:30 and struggle to balance his daughter's needs with his new responsibilities. Betty would remain ruthless and demanding and uncomfortable with emotions. But they'd built something better than perfect. They'd built something real, something that served people instead of profit margins, something that might outlive both of them. And that was enough. This story teaches us that true leadership requires looking beyond surface-level metrics to recognize genuine talent and human value. Betty's near-catastrophic mistake illustrates how rigid systems, performance reviews, attendance records, salary brackets, can blind us to exceptional work when it doesn't conform to traditional markers of success. Anthony's brilliance was invisible to her company not because it didn't exist, but because the structures designed to measure productivity were actually measuring conformity. The lesson extends beyond corporate settings. Whether we're evaluating employees, students, or even our own progress, we must remember that numbers tell incomplete stories. Real excellence often happens in the margins, after hours, in guest rooms, on blueprints decorated with a child's crayon drawings. The most important skill isn't efficiency or ruthlessness. It's the wisdom to question our own systems before they cause us to discard what we most need. And sometimes it takes a storm, a borrowed shirt, and a 7-year-old's insight to help us see that buildings and people should serve humanity, not just balance sheets. So here's the real question. Did you subscribe yet? Thousands of people will read this story and won't subscribe. Please don't be that person. Kindly support what I do here by subscribing. And then drop in the comment section if you like part 2 of Betty and Anthony's story. What challenges will they face implementing the Riverside project? How will David Mercer respond to being passed over? Will Betty's board support her radical restructuring? What happens when Anthony has to balance being lead architect with picking a layer up at 6? Let me know if you want to hear more.